I'm going to ask a few rhetorical questions and then a few real questions. Have you ever looked up into the sky on a dark night? It'd have to be a dark night here. Often due to the effects of light pollution, we can't really see very clearly into the sky. But I've been in the middle of Ghana in West Africa when, on one of the many occasions, the electricity has been out, and then you really do have a dark night, and you can see a huge number of stars. It's a really marvellous sight. And it sets you thinking. Well, it set me thinking anyway. Have you ever thought how far away they are? And how long it took the light from those stars to reach us? And how big is the universe? And how did it get there? And so on. And you get carried away with questions like that. And it's really stretching our understanding to look at those questions. Well, now, of course, you all know what our nearest star is, don't you? We call it the Sun, and it's approximately 93 million miles away. Now, I say approximately because it is. We are on a slightly elliptical orbit around it, so that the distance from the Sun is not uniform. For those of you who work in more modern measurements, that's 148.8 million kilometres. And do you know how long it takes the light to reach us from the Sun?
8 minutes.
Quite good. 8.3 minutes. Or to be more precise, 18 seconds. Well, sorry, 8 minutes and 18 seconds. And that's because it travels at about 186,000 miles a second. So that's good. I'm going to stretch your knowledge a little bit further. Apart from the Sun, what's the next nearest star?
Alpha Centauri?
Not bad, not bad. Technically speaking, it's the second nearest star afterwards. But because you probably couldn't see the nearest, because it's very faint, I'll give you that one, Roger. The first one is Proxima Centauri, which is a mere 4.24 light years away. But Alpha Centauri, which is bright, is 4.37 light years away. And you'll notice immediately I've leapt to light years rather than miles. If you want to work out the miles, it's really very simple. You multiply 4.37 by 60 by 60 by 24 by 364 5.25, and you'll get there. Times 186,000. Sorry, I nearly forgot that. And then you're pretty well in the ballpark for distance. It's an awful long way away, and my poor little brain can't work that out. But it's not just my poor little brain that can't do it. It's such a difficult concept for everybody that we talk in these terms of how long it takes the light actually to reach a place. Now, if we move from the stars nearest to us to the universe itself, it's computed at 90 billion light years in diameter and growing. So 90 billion times 60, and so on. That is truly mind-boggling, and I can't get my head around that. So how did it get there? It's something which is big beyond my comprehension. How did it get there? Well, I looked something up, as you do these days, on the internet. And according to space.com, which I have to say straight away is, I believe, an American site. It helps to explain some of their language. They're not very good at English. And it says on this site, nearly 14 billion years ago, there was nothing and nowhere. So far, so good. We don't depart from that in any particular whatsoever. It's what comes next that's the problem. You have to listen to this very carefully. Then, due to a random fluctuation in a completely empty void, now there's your first problem with the Americans, poor dears, because it's tautological. If it's a void, it's completely empty. But let's proceed. Due to a random fluctuation in a completely empty void, a universe exploded into existence. Something the size of a subatomic particle inflated to unimaginably huge size in a fraction of a second, driven apart by negative pressure vacuum energy. This is what is meant by the Big Bang. And this is the explanation that's accepted by, well, almost all astronomers, astronomical physicists, and so on. Whew, that's something to get your head round, isn't it? How something suddenly, in something which was completely empty, fluctuated and exploded and caused something unimaginably large. Now, elsewhere it goes on to tell us, because current instruments don't allow astronomers to peer back at the universe's birth, much of what we understand about the Big Bang theory comes from mathematical formulas. There's another. Formulae. Someone should teach them English. And models. And the mathematical formula in particular that they refer to is E equals mc squared, or energy equals mass times speed of light squared, which was some guy called Einstein invented. Well, again, this isn't strictly true, because they have, with the CERN accelerator, they've been trying to peer back in time, haven't they? And the problem with that, in terms of providing a satisfactory explanation of the origins of the universe, is that they've set the preconditions, and they have structured something which allows those preconditions to operate. And yet, who's to say they're the correct preconditions? But anyway, let's leave that to one side. The basic question we're confronted with, whatever you make of the Big Bang theory, is we have a choice, a fundamental choice, if we're going to understand the origins of the universe. Either we believe in a random fluctuation in a completely empty void, based on an understanding from mathematical formulae and models, or we believe another unprovable explanation. And that's a key point that I want to make at the very outset, that neither the Big Bang nor the explanation I'm going to present to you is provable in an empirical sense, i.e. I cannot demonstrate it to you in front of you now. But the other explanation is the reading that we had by way of introduction. And it's much plainer, at least. Verse 3 of Hebrews 11. By faith, and I'm reading from the English Standard Version here, by faith we understand that the universe was created by the word of God, so that what is seen was not made out of things that are visible. So it is actually explaining the same thing, how something which is visible and enormous came to be out of nothing at all. And the Bible tells us that it is by faith that we understand that. Now, does that mean that there's no coherent evidence upon which to base that faith? No, it doesn't. What we said was that neither that explanation nor the Big Bang are capable of being, at the present moment and under present circumstances, empirically proven. So the question arises, I think, why might it be reasonable to believe that the universe and everything came about as part of the purpose of God, and not, as it were, by accident because of a random fluctuation. So even presupposing that the Big Bang Theory offered an explanation of the origins of the universe, it actually offers absolutely no explanation whatsoever of life within that universe, and specifically on Earth. And not just any life, but you've only to look around, study a few books, and see the enormous variety of life forms that exist on this Earth. And the complex nature of these life forms, the huge range of conditions necessary to support that life, and symbiotic relationships that exist between one form of life and another. Now, a recently deceased scientist, whose brain was apparently the size of Western Europe, Stephen Hawking, said this in 2006. The odds against a universe like ours emerging out of something like the Big Bang are enormous. I think there are clearly religious implications. Now, Stephen Hawking wasn't a religious man. But just think about that opening statement again. The odds against a universe like ours emerging out of something like the Big Bang are enormous. It's a miracle. But if someone explaining something from a biblical point of view used the word miracle, would be ridiculed by the scientific community. So, why are we here? Why are we as we are? We're not going to have too many references today, but the next one we're going to is in Isaiah chapter 45. Just 2 verses there, which I think helps to answer both of those questions. Why are we here? Why as we are as we are? Verse 12 of Isaiah 45, and if you go to the beginning of verse 11, it says, "Thus says the Lord." So these are the words of God. "I made the earth and created man on it. It was my hands that stretched out the heavens, and I commanded all their host." And then go on to verse 18. "Thus says the Lord who created the heavens," he is God, in case we were in any doubt, "who formed the earth and made it. He established it." He didn't create it empty. He formed it to be inhabited. "I am the Lord and there is no other." So the Bible's telling us clearly that creation is the work of God, and he formed this earth to be inhabited. There was a purpose. This isn't something random. There was a purpose to the formation of this earth with the circumstances that exist upon it. The so-called Goldilocks principle. It wasn't too much, it wasn't too hot, wasn't too cold, it was just right. And we've got to try and understand why that was. And frankly, just to assert, because that's what critics of the Bible often do, and Dawkins is one of the worst in this respect in terms of assertion rather than detailed and explicit explanation. Just to assert that all these different forms of life came about as a result of a random evolutionary process, that simply won't do. If you're a halfway intelligent person, any rational sort of person, then what you require is not assertion, you require explanation. And an explanation which is coherent and logical. And I maintain that, certainly hasn't satisfied me, their explanations. There are too many gaps, too many suppositions, too many assumptions. So let's have a look and see if it makes any sense at all to believe the biblical explanation. And I want to look at the examples posed by a few animals, and we'll see whether the evolutionary explanation of things could conceivably be correct, or whether the biblical explanation is correct. And the first one that I want to pick on is the peregrine falcon. Now, I don't know whether you know this or not, but it is the fastest creature on Earth. And we have them in this country. I mean, they exist elsewhere. Any idea what speeds they reach?
120 miles an hour.
200 miles an hour. You'd have to drive a Bugatti Veyron or a Formula One car to reach the speed of a peregrine falcon. That's over 300 kilometres an hour. And it reaches that, well, it can out-accelerate probably even a Formula One car. And that's astonishing. Now, there are a number of things about the peregrine falcon and the way that it lives, the way that it feeds, that I want to think about. And there are at least 7 things, all of which need to be in place simultaneously. Being partially developed or one thing arriving after another won't work, as you'll see. The first thing is that it needs excellent eyesight, because its method for catching its prey is that it climbs to a high altitude. So it needs to be able to see down and to locate its prey, and then it needs to be able to lock onto it whilst moving at the excessive speed that it dives at. And it has to be pinpoint accurate if it is going to make a successful kill. Now, with the best will in the world, you could take a pigeon up to the same height. I use a pigeon as an example because it's one of the favourite prey of the peregrine falcon. You could take a pigeon up to the same height and sort of incline it to dive, but it would never reach 200 miles an hour. The only reason the peregrine falcon reaches 200 miles an hour as it goes into a dive is its extraordinary aerodynamic shape. It folds its wings back and it goes into a teardrop shape. And it is the perfect aerodynamic shape, which allows it to accelerate to that phenomenal speed. Now that's great, that is. If you had excellent eyesight but couldn't go at that speed, you wouldn't catch your pigeon. If you could go at that speed but you couldn't work out exactly where you're aiming, you'd never catch a pigeon. But it's worse than that, because if you're going at 200 miles an hour and you have a conventional pair of lungs, as the peregrine falcon does, the air going in through your nostrils would go into your lungs and they would go bang. And that would be the end of the peregrine falcon. So there has to be some other means of allowing it to travel at that excessive speed. And there are 2 remarkably clever pieces of design. Firstly, there are battles that come over the entrance into the lungs and deflect the air so that it goes straight through. And these are so effective that something similar is now used on jet aircraft. And the other thing is that they therefore effectively close off the lungs. Before they go into the dive, they store air in the lungs to allow them to dive without the necessity of breathing. There's all very well shutting off the lungs, but if you haven't got the air there to breathe, you're in big trouble as well. So this is a remarkable piece of design that allows the peregrine falcon to do that. And if you're diving at 200 miles an hour, you need either a wonderful set of goggles to protect your eyes, which will stop them drying out, or indeed stop all manner of flies and such like, insect life getting in your eyes and various bits of dust and so on. Either you need a wonderful set of goggles over your eyes, or you need self-lactating eyes where the eyelids constantly keep the eyes moist and clear. And of course that helps to contribute towards their eyesight. And it's all very well and good diving at 200 mile an hour, being able to see your prey and plotting its direction of flight and so on. But if you can't control the angle or the direction of your dive, that's pretty useless, isn't it? Because you're going to miss it. If it changed direction, you've had it. No, the peregrine falcon has excellent directional control as well. And then what happens when you actually get to your prey? A pigeon is much the same size as a peregrine falcon. The falcon has to be able to grab, hold and carry its prey. Prey the same size as it. And there's another problem which arises there. If you're travelling at 200 miles an hour and you meet something like a pigeon, the chances are that the pigeon will explode into a million pieces when you impact on it, but so will you. And that would be the end of the peregrine falcon again. So the peregrine falcon basically targets the wing of the pigeon, which actually allows it to pass through. And finally, because of its particular physical capabilities, it needs a specialised digestive system. Now, as I said at the beginning, all of these have to be there at the same time. It's absolutely no good having one without the other, because either you'd have an extinct peregrine falcon because it had exploded on impact with a pigeon, or it would have blown up itself travelling at that high speed, or whatever. And it's no good sort of thinking, well, it started off diving at 100 mile an hour and then it sort of made its way up to 110 and then 100. That explanation really, well, it's so foolish as to lack any sort of credibility. All of them had to be there at the same time, or there was disaster and consequent extinction. So, under the evolutionary explanation, how did it get there? How did all of those features of the peregrine falcon get there? Did they all come across randomly? Remember the evolutionary imperative. Well, it's quite difficult actually. There's a number of different imperatives apparently. One, it has to be that it's without design. But even if it was a case of adaptation, so you have so much accumulated adaptation that it amounts in some weird and wonderful way to evolution, how did all this come about? How did it evolve? How did it survive the process when not all of the features were fully developed? Did it somehow think its way to this advanced state of design? Well, the brain of a peregrine falcon is no bigger than its eye. And it's taxing yours and my sense of credulity, really, to suggest that came about by random forces. Well, the Bible's got an alternative explanation. It's in Genesis chapter 1. And it's a very simple, straightforward explanation. Genesis chapter 1 and verse 21, it says, "So God created the great sea creatures and every living creature that moves with which the waters swarm, according to their kinds, and every winged bird according to its kind. And God saw that it was good." So rather than the peregrine of having in some weird and wonderful way evolved from another flying creature, the Bible tells us that God created each and every bird in its particular kind. Didn't have to evolve from anything else, which is just as well, because I want to go to another bird. which is, if you like, the polar opposite of the peregrine falcon. I want to look at the barn owl, another of our local birds. Now, the peregrine falcon is the fastest creature on earth. The barn owl most certainly isn't. It's one of the slowest flying birds. The peregrine uses this very advanced eyesight to target its prey. The barn owl doesn't. It actually uses sound. And it has what we call ears, but offset ears to allow a triangulation process to take place in order to detect its prey, which is not pigeons, but mice and voles. And unlike the peregrine again, it needs to be able to swallow its prey whole. And that's another adaptation, no, not the right word, another feature of its digestive system that's totally different from the peregrine. Now, if you have an evolutionary explanation, then both of these birds basically descended from the same root. They've ended up remarkably different. Silent flight. Now there's a concept. Just think about that. It's easy to say, oh, they fly silently so the mice and voles don't hear them. But using very sophisticated listening equipment, clever people have tested the sounds that different creatures make flying through the air. And a pigeon, believe it or not, makes enough noise. The oscillations are going like that. The peregrine would be even more. The barn owl, the noise coming from the barn owl in flight barely moves the oscillator. How does it manage that? Well, it's all to do with the feathers. It's all to do with the feathers. You see, the barn owl has particular design of feathers totally different from the peregrine falcon. And they actually allow, they are unique to the barn owl, they actually allow it to fly virtually silently. There's only one small problem. These feathers are not very good in the wet, which is why you don't often see barn owls out hunting if it's raining. Now again, did the barn owl work this all out for himself? Did it decide that ears set like the peregrines, equally spaced, weren't quite right for detecting prey? I need to offset them a bit. What arrant nonsense. We could look at all manner of creatures. If I were doing this talk in Africa, in this really rather good book here, there's another example provided, which is the Black Mamba, which is a snake with which the people I've met out there are very familiar because they come across it far too often. And of course the Black Mamba is not black, it's actually sort of greenish. The black bit is in its mouth. And how the Black Mamba developed its toxin is another very interesting piece to think about. And so I'd recommend you read it. How are we going to explain these things in terms other than how the Bible explains it in that opening chapter, that God designed them to be as they are? And there's another animal that we haven't thought about yet, and he's called Homo Sapiens. That's you and me. What of man or woman? The Bible tells us a number of things about men and women. Let's go to our other reference, which is in the book of Psalm 139. And I want to pick it up at verse 13. And the psalmist says, "For you formed my inward parts, you knitted me together in my mother's womb. I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works, my soul knows it very well. My frame was not hidden from you when I was being made in secret, intricately woven in the depths of the earth." And so on. In fact, the whole of that psalm is particularly helpful in understanding that it was God who designed man to be as he is. That's what the Bible tells us. And if we just stop to think about the complexity of the human body and the human character, I think that again gives a further challenge to the notion that we're the result of random forces. Now, I don't know about you, but we spoke about the stars at the beginning. I have never tried to count them. Not even the ones I can see, let alone the ones I can't see. But people who are far cleverer than me and have access to equipment that allows them to compute the number of stars, they tell us that the human brain has more connections between its neurons than there are stars in the galaxy. That's a phenomenal thought, isn't it? In these little brains of ours, there are more connections than there are stars in the galaxy. Wow. How did something that complicated get there? But I could go on about the physical capabilities of man and the way the different parts of the body react together, and how if they weren't all fully developed, man would be a pretty sorry thing. You could just think about the ear, because the ear isn't just for hearing, it's for balance. And if the ear weren't fully developed, man wouldn't be able to stand up. He'd be rolling around uncontrollably on the floor. How would he escape his prey under those circumstances? Survival of the fittest, he wouldn't have got very far, would he? He'd have been slow and helpless. But let's think about things other than the human physical capabilities. Let's think about characteristics and qualities that humans have, which in many respects, I would say in all respects, are unique. The aesthetic, the emotional. I've never seen an emotional or emotionally developed lion. It doesn't have a conscience about catching its prey. The psychological, the spiritual, the intellectual, the rational. All of these are capabilities, qualities that make us unique. So where's the common evolutionary descent? If we have all of these qualities that make us unique. And there's another question that we need to ask. Are these necessary for survival? No. You can survive without enjoying music, appreciating painting or sculpture, good literature, whatever. So there's no evolutionary imperative. There's no adaptation to develop these characteristics because they're essential. No, because they're not essential. But they are what mark humans out from any other creature. So the question again is, how do they get there? Well, we're nearly finished. C.S. Lewis once described human existence as a senseless contortion upon the face of idiotic matter. Now, if that was so, then we would expect to find none of those things, none of those qualities that I've just talked about. But we do. So, does it make sense, is it reasonable to look at the biblical explanation of the origins of the universe, life and everything? Is it reasonable to look at that explanation? Or do you have to be feeble-minded or gullible to believe it? Well, I hope that I've shown that you don't have to be feeble-minded or gullible to believe the biblical explanation. Of course, we can't prove it empirically. That's why in Hebrews it says, by faith we understand these things. But there is ample evidence. And it's certainly no less reasonable to accept the biblical explanation of things than it is the various theories that have been propounded to provide an alternative explanation. So, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Thank you for listening.